and welcome to PodRocket. I'm Noel, and today we have Aurora Scharff, Senior Consultant at Crayon Consulting, here to talk about modern React patterns, concurrent rendering, actions, and what's next. Welcome to PodRocket, Aurora. Before we kind of get into stuff too much here, can we just talk a little bit about, from a high level, what are some of these like concurrent features that we're talking about, and like what's the problem we're really addressing here? Is there like a specific UI quirk we see that these are trying to help us with?
So thank you for having me on the show. This is very exciting. There's a bunch of different concurrent features that a lot of them came out in React 18, but we're now seeing more of them work together with some of the newer features in 19. So first of all, we have useTransition, which lets us mark a set of state updates as a lower priority update, which then all execute at the same time once the transition completes. And then it can be interrupted by high priority updates like inputs and clicks, and it provides a built-in pending state. So this is useful both for rendering optimization from like React 18 version and also async calls in 19.
What's like an example? I think it's easier, especially when people don't have a visual, to have something concrete right away. I was just looking at the docs and looking at examples, but when I hear about these things, my impulse is always, I don't know if I typically feel this, because if I'm using a text input with a search box, like there's an async thing that happens there, but I'm waiting for the results to come back anyway. I'm usually not blocking input. Like, when does this actually become a problem?
So we have two kind of versions of this. You have the rendering optimization version, which is just, okay, let's say you have some slow components or a bunch of slow components that is actually blocking your rendering. You can mark the state update going to trigger this slow component becoming visible as a transition, which means it's lower priority and you won't block the page when this is happening. And you can get away from that and see, for example, let's say you have a tab. The tab has this expensive component. It's slow. It's going to block your clicks around in the tab. If it's a transition, that means that we don't have that blocking and we can see while it's pending that it's pending.
Elizabeth here, production assistant for PodRocket. We're running a listener survey to help shape future episodes and make the podcast a better experience. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes of your time, and you can find the link in the description.
I'm zooming out maybe a little more than you probably do kind of in this typically, but are there tools you find helpful to kind of figure out which of these components are actually blocking, like when you step into a site or when you're working on one?
I think at least now with the compiler and everything, you don't really encounter this. Hey, maybe I should optimize this. It's more like, hey, this is actually not working. I need to fix it. So luckily, we're in the state where we don't need to look for things to optimize, rather just fix them when they occur. So that's like the one part of it. But with React 19, we also have the async transitions, which is just more useful for tracking the state of some sort of async function.
What does that look like? Have you found starting to use transition to feel pretty intuitive, or have you found that it opens up your workflow at all?
For sure. Definitely tracking an async call is just like you're used to doing set loading, true, do the await or call the function, set it to false, maybe catch the error, fix some state depending on what happened. You have this normal flow, and that whole flow is just simplified into a transition. So for sure, when you start trying this version of useTransition, you just simplify a lot of your workflow, and you don't have to do this manual state updates every time you're talking to the server.
For people listening at home, especially those writing a lot of React, maybe they're just like in another framework, what does that actually look like? We can focus on useTransition specifically, because I think that's probably the easiest to kind of...
Like the syntax?
Block. Yeah, like how does it differ from using a loading state like you explained a second ago?
It's a hook. It returns a pending flag and it returns a function to start a transition. And then you put whatever state updates and async calls you're going to execute inside that transition. And then you get the pending state. And that's it. And it's going to be synced to the async call and execute at the end of async call. So you have this very smooth transition, this very smooth transition where there's no like weird flickers or states that update not when the API actually gave you the response, those things.
Are there any kind of common traps that devs fall into, or maybe that you fell into in making this transition? Because I feel like we're so mentally trained into using loading state explicitly and manage it. Is there any kind of like, I don't need to do this anymore, or aha moments here when converting to some of these newer hooks?
I think anytime you're calling an async function based on some user interaction, you should try a transition. And it's probably going to be easier and it's going to be better. A
situation that I feel comes up a lot, that it's difficult to even talk about, but I feel often in React apps, we have this kind of flow where like we try to always structure things well, but we end up in this mode where there's an input like 7 layers down in some component here, and then that needs to go like up 4 layers and then down 3 more and change something here. Do you find that those kinds of gross hierarchies are harder or more difficult to manage in this kind of async rendering world where this is put on the dev to kind of think about a little bit more, but then it's handled more nicely? Or do you think that it's like that plumbing is the same amount of difficulty either way?
I think maybe it depends on how you build your apps. And if you're using a framework, a lot of that, or some sort of library that's handling more of that work for you, it would not be that complex. So it definitely depends on what framework or what library you're using to build your apps.
Can we talk a little bit about that, especially in that framework case? Is it difficult to transition older apps that are built like pretty framework dependent? Is it difficult to transition them into this async world like with React 19?
You could say that it's a different, you're building your app one way, now you have a arguably better way to build it.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not worth refactoring things, but just getting in the right mindset and seeing the alternatives as you keep on building is a good bet.
Do you have any experience here, like in doing that conversion, like reopening an old project for the first time and being like, oh, some of this stuff should be async? I feel the thing that always happens there is you're like, there's all these patterns here. I'm introducing new complexity. I don't want devs to have to think about two different things. How do you make that decision? When is it enough to be like, okay, we should probably actually use async hooks here?
I did actually experience this recently. I was like helping another project just to review their best practices. And you definitely see a lot of cases where, you could maybe have done this instead of this. But that doesn't mean you have to go and change it. But just knowing about what patterns in your code base could be done differently, I think that's a realization that makes you easier see those patterns in the future.
Maybe it would be helpful to talk a little bit about what those patterns are. I'm thinking largely in terms of managing these large projects to make it easier for devs to kind of step in and get into this headspace of like, oh, we have useTransition, we have useOptimistic now. Are there any kind of like conventions or anything you recommend to help devs follow that and understand what's going on at a glance when they look at a given component a little bit more easily?
I think with these new features, like combining the concurrent ones from 18 and the 19 features, they explain themselves. So once you see useOptimistic, you know what it does. And then combining that with naming conventions that explain the behavior of something, that will be going to tell you how that interaction behaves.
Gotcha. What's like an example of that? What have you seen works particularly well? As far as naming conventions, like in a component?
Yeah, so let's talk about the form component. So the React 19 form component, they released this version of the form in 19, which is it's like building on top of the HTML form. So the HTML form, the default one is like you have a form, action, and then a route, right? Whereas now it can also take in a function. So you have two versions to call something on your form submission. And that's very clear because of the naming convention. And an action is a certain way, or a transition function is a certain way, and then your onSubmit is a different way. So that's an example of, in practice, what that looks like. And you would understand the behavior based on the property.
I think it's hard to even discuss this without getting into the specifics of server-side rendering a little bit. Did you know where I was going with that question? We get into this mode. There's so many concerns now. It feels like this is also much more complicated than it was a little bit. And I think there's varying opinions on how well the React team has made this transition, or I guess the Next team a little bit. Have you found these hooks to be easy to have in more like server rendered apps, easy to use in more server rendered apps? Or is there, back to my prior question, are there like cases where this can be tricky when you're not explicitly thinking about where the rendering is going to occur for a given component?
So this is more regarding the server side. Of course, we're going to talk about like Next.js and frameworks, but at least, for example, for Next.js, it's built around features in a way that it just naturally becomes the solution that you need. Whereas maybe in a different framework, let's say React Router v7, they already have different or established patterns. Maybe you're not going to feel the need of the new patterns as much because you already have alternatives. But Next.js really integrates with this whole concurrent and async view because that's the way it's built. So it's already built around suspense and such.
Yeah. Can you not think of any cases where, even like when just learning due to lack of knowledge, where the new like async hooks maybe do something unexpected or just are tricky when dealing with server-side rendering?
When they're tricky when dealing with server-side rendering.
Yeah. Are there any cases at all that are just like, oh, this one is actually client-side and I'd forgotten about that, and I have this concern here where I don't typically have it? Or the inverse of like, oh, this is like a server-side render, but there's like a child here that's like only able to be rendered in the client. Is there any weirdness here with like the gap between the two?
Yeah, now we're getting into the whole server component story, which is like a whole nother thing, which I'm purposely trying to like keep away from my upcoming talk at Aria Universe, because I know it's difficult and people are like, oh, I don't want to think about that right now. And that's why I'm like trying to focus more on the client version and usages of this. But definitely there are some things that like, what? Why is, okay, because you put it in this pattern now, you cannot no longer use it in this way. Yeah, but I think that's a lot to go into right now, maybe.
Yeah, it can be so tough to balance that. And like the set of concerns is slightly different, right? The problem with asynchronicity is kind of like pushed into a different domain when you're in that world. I'm optimistic that it'll be fine, but I think it's tricky right now, especially when we're already in this state of having to balance mentally what's going on there. But like,
it's a learning curve, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. To pull us back a little bit, in your talk, you said that some of the inspiration were from some like good examples you've seen online. Is there anything you'd point devs to look at to have a good baseline of how some of these new async hooks can work?
What I've noticed reading a lot of documentation is the React documentation now, even the ones for rendering optimization like useTransition, use deferred value, are largely focused on the async and the data fetching approach where you would suspend something and then handle a specific behavior. So I think just reading the documentation, and they have these really good code sandboxes, right? So if you haven't been exploring the docs much, maybe you haven't really dug into them, but for every sort of concept, there's a code sandbox. And then what you can do is you can read it, but even better, just click fork and then try it. And you will see that there's more implementation details that maybe weren't so clear to you just by seeing the example itself, where when you open it and you get to see the whole code, you can really play with it and maybe get some inspiration for your own projects. And then for sure, applying that. Maybe you have a case in your head, maybe I could use it here, this exact component, and then trying it. That's a great way to learn, I think.
It's easier to break stuff. You can introduce like artificial delays and all that stuff a little bit more easily. It can be tough, especially if you're trying to be proactive about it. Like you said earlier, we notice this is a problem like when it's happening, or like when we're, but there's always the impulse. It's like, well, yeah, but I'm like sitting here on a brand new $1,100 MacBook or something. I feel like a lot of this is happening when a user's on a cell phone going through a tunnel in a car or something. This is when I really care about the app not becoming a stuttery mess. So I think it can be easier to see that kind of stuff there. Are there specific approaches here to use the new hooks and get them into the correct kind of place in the component hierarchy? Going back to my prior question of trying to keep track of which pieces of your app are slow when trying to be more proactive. Is there a good kind of level of zoom here that you find where to put like a useOptimistic call? You typically err on the side of having it higher up or like very low near where the slow piece of a given component tree might be?
So that's a great question. And I think there's been maybe some confusion about this. So the way I think about it is all of these are something you typically do locally in a component, and it's for that component. And if you're doing something bigger, maybe let's say you're doing this CRUD or something and you want it optimistic, maybe you're actually not doing useOptimistic, you're using React Query, something like that. So it's really good for these local components that have some sort of very simple concern in the component itself that you can now solve combining transitions with useOptimistic. Let's say you have, I did this example, you have a save product to favorites on some sort of shopping website. It's just a simple, very small button, but just having a quick interaction there and then afterwards firing the actual update. It's just like one line of code and it's concerned for the component only. Those cases, or like a favorite if you have a simple click that just needs to feel interactive.
Are those cases ever particularly problematic? Because I feel like historically, the impulse was always just, if you're in the useOptimistic, then you just like make a call, like a web call, and you don't await it. And you're like, it'll be fine. Like this will probably work. I'm going to fire this off and assume everything is okay. But there's the desire to have that, like, I want to make this as good as I can.
Yeah,
and if something goes wrong, are there clean ways? Because I feel like what should typically happen in those cases, just from a UX standpoint, it's hard to map this to everything, but it's like typically like I want to do the thing and let the user get on with their day. But then if something goes wrong, I don't want them to like completely lose. Like I could just display an error message, but that's not going to be super helpful. Have you found useOptimistic is helpful, or I guess any of these hooks is helpful to like get the user back to a point where they can do the thing again without completely blocking until the result comes back?
So I think what we can do to understand that is just to recap what useOptimistic does differently from other hooks, because it is a weird one. And so what's special here is, first of all, it must be called inside a transition. And then you have this create an optimistic state that only exists while this transition is completing. So let's say we have this save to my favorites for a product. This you can call useOptimistic and set is saved true. And then it's only going to exist for as long as that async call completing the save to favorites is still ongoing. And after it's done, it will automatically sync to the real value. So that means that it's just, you have a click, it's instant, it probably is fine. You don't see any weird state updates. It's just clean. But in the case that something went wrong, it reverts or it feels like it rolls back, but it's just rolling back to the initial past value, which is now from the truth from the server or from some other source.
Are there particular kind of patterns here from like an API perspective? Like let's say you control the backend and the front end. Does the API of the hook itself, does that more easily lend itself to specific ways of designing front-end back-end interactions? Is it better to be returning generally a larger like state object than from these calls that kind of can more easily be reapplied to the front end to instruct it how to render? Or can we like still have very atomic small actions that are like acting on one piece of data? Because I think both have their pros and cons historically, but when we're in this mode of wanting to be able to like recover cleanly, have you found the way that useOptimistic is structured kind of pushes you one direction or the other?
It just falls back to the real value on failure, or you could say the fail value, wherever it gets its sort of data from, that's what it's going to fall back to. So you don't need to like return anything. It comes from the data source. You can think of it like an automatic rollback, but it's not really a rollback. It's just discarding some state.
I'm trying to think of a good example here where I've run into this problem in the past where like I'm thinking in things where like you'd expect this submit to change other state elsewhere. So you like do hacky stuff on the client to be like, it'll probably look like this, like when they're done. And then you're like, oh no, wait, like if this fails, I then also, so then you end up in this weird mode where you're like trying to get computed state to all be correct.
I think that's like the worst, right? At least for those bigger, like your case you're talking about here, which is what we're familiar with, like you would have some library help you with that, like the optimistic update syntax query. It will handle that for you. Whereas useOptimistic, probably it's just like smaller. The way I'm using it anyway is for smaller specific components where they have some state that they're expecting. And then you get the nice UI. And if something goes wrong, it's automatically reverting. And you can just click that action again and see if it's going to work again.
Maybe you can have some kind of feedback displayed in the interim. But
yeah, it depends on how you're doing it.
Yeah, the specific setup. useTransition in general, there's been people talking about it. But I think doing this, it's easy to talk about when we talk about like how easy it is. But I think that there is a little bit more work here that we're saying needs to be done all the time. How do you kind of balance that trade-off in putting this concurrency problem into the developer's lap explicitly a little bit more? Because I think like it is another concern here, and there's like a balance that needs to be struck. And maybe I've asked this question already, but where does it feel like it's worth trying to reshape how we think about UIs to like do this? Should we always just be in this mode and this is our default way of thinking? Or is it like we put this hat on when we have a problem that seems like it needs fixed?
I mean, you're always building something that's talking to the API. So anytime you're creating a loading state of some sort, probably there's some feature that's better, like a suspense boundary or a transition, depending on if I'm transition, or if you're creating an error state, maybe you should be using an error boundary, all these declarative options that handle this for you. And same for useOptimistic, you don't need your optimistic state and then set state back on failure. These examples, for sure.
This is off topic, but when you're using like websites, when you're interacting with them, do you get into that mode where you're like, oh, these guys are using the new transitions, or they did a lot of work historically to make this feel like they weren't? Or is it like, whatever, I'm just a web user, I don't really
think yes. I was like looking at this app. I'm like, wait, this is a really nice loading state. How did he do that? Oh, okay. It looks like this, right? Could have been like this. But I think those cases where you notice it not where it should be a transition, you'll see the UI like flicker of some sort and doesn't match the update from the server. So there's like examples of this in documentation. And actually I wrote a blog post just today preparing for this podcast. I was like making this combo box.
Oh yeah.
Without a transition, the search in the combo box, the options like jump around, right? Because it's not in sync with the actual async function doing the search. So those are the examples that you can feel, okay, this is jittery, probably should be using a transition, or for the right terminology here, using an action.
We'll be sure to have a link to the post if we can get it wired up. I'm trying to think of a recent use case that I've run into where like I probably should have reached for one of these and I didn't, because I feel like it's easy to always think about the form components. And I'm particularly trying to think of any examples that aren't like purely based around web requests. Because I think when we talk about these, we're always just like, all of the examples are always like, the server is slow, right? Or the network is slow or whatever. Do you have any examples where you've used any of these for something like else, like system stuff or like a systems API that may not be super responsive, or in anything else outside of just like network or like upstream delay?
I think for the version of these features, which is for like suspended components or asynchronous calls, that's when you need it. But then you have the other aspect, which is for rendering optimization, which is what we already had in 18. So it depends on which.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the rendering optimization is,
it's more niche. You don't encounter doing that as often, I think, whereas the 19 APIs, they really can replace a lot of your complex code, like in everyday code.
Even people working on apps that aren't like, it's not like this data comes back and I'm doing hundreds of UI updates a second and like this thing needs to be like, I don't know, like you have some kind of stock trading app or something. I think in those cases you like really would care about non-blocking rendering performance, but like
lists, filtering lists.
Exactly, like giant tables and stuff like that. Yeah, like I think that those do come into play. But I just anecdotally, I feel like, the impulse is correct. It's like, no, like everyone has this problem where everyone's doing web stuff, like async calls. We're all writing web apps. Everyone's got this problem. But yeah, I feel like I'm always hunting for a good example where it's, no, we want to have this kind of like async feel, but it's not just because of network. There's something else interesting going on here, like with system hardware or something that could be slow.
I mean, transitions work for rendering. If there's, let's say you have a processor problem, maybe something is not running, transitions will also let you track the state of that. Yeah, I suppose that's it.
You probably use one for something pretty cleanly, like requesting like mic access, like those kinds of things. Like when you open an app and I need to access the microphone or the webcam or whatever, you could probably do something pretty clean there.
There's a lot of options. The more you play with them, the more you realize how many cases this could work for. Definitely.
On that note, are there any specific like aspects of this that have surprised you while coming up with this talk or experimenting with these new patterns in particular that have opened your eyes a little bit?
I think just how they all intertwine. And I was like reading the old React V18 announcement. Like it says there, even in the announcement there, in the future, we plan on using this for data fetching. It's okay. So it's all coming together and it all has the same components that all kind of behave. It's a declarative way to think about what's important, what's less important, how do your loading states look like, how do your error states, and it all just works in this one API. That's really fascinated me recently, how they have the same API or the components function the same but can handle different things.
That's pretty cool. It sounds like you've had your ear to the ground here. Are there any particular tools or like something as simple as like a lint rule or something that happens at runtime? Or is there anything you found here that really kind of helps push you in this direction or makes it easier to interface with these new like hooks concerned with concurrent rendering and optimistic updates and transitions and all that stuff?
Yeah, the reactive tools are great. If you don't use them, probably you should be using them more because they're great. There's like new features, like I think you can toggle suspense boundaries. You can see server components. Of course, you can profile performance, that sort of thing. And now with the compiler, you can also see what components have been automatically memorized by the compiler. So for sure, the reactive tools.
Yeah, the reactive tools are pretty good. I feel like every time I open them up and I'm in there, I'm like, oh, this is a neat new feature. Yeah, I find something new every time. Yeah. Is there anything else on the talk or anything else in particular you wanted to touch on here?
I can maybe talk a little bit about the inspiration. So I was like doing some work in my consulting job, and I was building, actually I was building in the autocomplete component or a combo box. And we were using Aria Kit, and I was like playing around with Aria Kit, looking at the examples. And I found this example, which was like Next.js router select. I was like, okay, what is this? This is interesting. I couldn't see the code because it was like premium. I was like, okay, interesting. I'll just play with it. And I noticed that when you selected something, it wouldn't actually update the label right away, because the way the router works in Next.js, you have to wait for that update to happen. If it's like a search param, the search param will trigger, and then it will re-render the page, and then it will update the search param. So that means that your select is going to be delayed, right? And this is a very common problem a lot of developers face it's not a real problem, it's just the way it works. And developers face this and get confused, like, how do I fix this? And in that case, I was like, I really want to make this example better. So I started talking with the creator of Aria Kit, and hey, I have this idea. And I read this part in the useTransition docs about exposing action properties, and I had never tried it. And I was thinking, maybe I can see if this would work for this case. And that was the trigger. And I realized, okay, you can actually expose action properties just like the form component does with the form action, but for your own reusability. And that allowed me to kind of fix this example where it would be smoother. So basically that's the story. And I really wanted to build around that because I hadn't seen that pattern done in practice before. Yeah.
Do you see it everywhere all the time now? You're like, I could fix this. This is
I think it's a little bit, as you're getting used to new patterns, you don't always see them. You're like, maybe. But then as you progress and you start using something, then you all of a sudden, you realize where you could make changes. That's why that's like the basis, or one of the things I'm touching on in the talk, because I want to showcase how you could build something reusable with actions or transitions. Yeah.
I feel like that's as good a transition as any. We do a quick round here. On that note of getting used to new patterns, what's your favorite UI pattern overall that you think most devs overlook?
Well, of course, I'm going to be influenced by my current work. And I've been working with server components recently, as I do. And just using the React.children and those APIs to create some sort of wrapper for server components. That's very interesting because you can all of a sudden, it's like a puzzle. You can do some sort of UI update based on the contents of a component without actually knowing what's there. And for server components, that means you can keep your data fetching on the server and such. And you don't have to optimize this, but it's fun to try. And in the client side, maybe there's better options like context or render props. But yeah, it's a cool pattern for server.
Especially for the server rendering. Cool. What is the last library you tried just for fun?
Redwood SDK, the new Redwood. I tried that. Yeah. I completed the whole tutorial. I really recommend that. It was really long and very detailed and really good. So definitely lets you try out and understand all of the features. So it's like a more natural and simplified way to work with server components and React 19 and all of the things that you maybe already know from Next.js, but you don't have the same rules and conventions if that's something that you maybe don't like, which I know some people don't like, right?
I was very impressed with the new Redwood docs as well. I think they have the advantage of it being kind of like a clean slate and stuff, but they're a joy to go through for sure. Is there a tool or extension you couldn't live without right now?
Maybe you know what I'm going to say. Cloud for Copilot agent mode. So I work for enterprise. We use Microsoft, and that's why I use GitHub Copilot. And I might be wrong, but it seems like all of these features from Cursor already are available also in Copilot. So it works for me. And it took me some time to get into the whole AI development flow and for the tools to be good enough as well to actually be useful in your day-to-day work. But now I can't live without it anymore.
We'll see now that OpenAI's got the new model out that Cursor can use with the CLI. I think this will get a lot more interesting. This was yesterday as we're recording. So it's so hard to get a good barometer of how well this is actually working for devs because everyone's stories are oh, I use this all the time. Some people are I can't get it to do anything other than logs. And it's just, we'll see how it progresses.
I'm happy I got into the correct flow here and I'm able to work more efficiently and more productively.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad you found the path that works. Cool. All right. That was all I had. Thank you for joining me and chatting about components, Aurora. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Have a good one.